In this segment, we're going to talk about political and military reforms and how the Philippines was shifting the way it was managed, or how there was shifting management practices in the Philippines, and ultimately the effects these would have on those people who would eventually join the Philippine Revolution. So, in terms of political reforms, you have firstly changes in the management of the Philippines. For example, there are new taxation policies, and we have two samples here, the cedula personal and the contribución industrial. So that's identification card and income tax. Ang ibig sabihin lang nito ay they're trying to scope out how many people exactly in the Philippines are working so that they can have better taxation collection. At yung effect nito ay ultimately, a lot of people would begin to feel the pressure of taxation more kasi they would keep adding new taxes to compensate for the lack of money coming from other sources of Spanish support. Kasi nawala na yung colonies, and then Spain is going through a lot of difficulties. So they're putting the pressure on the Philippines to collect more money from it. Now, you have another reform, which is a new set of policies called the Ordinances of Good Government, was released by the Spanish government. So, this is a reflection actually of the liberal policies being introduced in the mainland of Spain. So, ang dami nito kasi there's several booklets of it. But basically, parang nag-release sila ng guidebook on how we're going to rationalize Philippine governance now. Some of the changes under this reform were some positions became electoral, and new qualifications are set for colonial administrators. Hindi pwedeng, ay ito pinsan ko to, ipapasok natin siya sa pwestong to, or ay ito isa siyang parang influential person from Spain, we're gonna give him a position in a province in the Philippines. It couldn't happen like that anymore because sometimes, or quite often, before, yung mga inuupo nilang colonial administrators ay hindi naman qualified talaga para sa posisyong iyon. And that would cause a lot of problems in the implementation of policies here in the Philippines. So, they're trying to kind of reorient the way we're managed. But also they're trying to collect more taxes from the Philippines as well. Now, in terms of military reforms, you find that some places that were before inaccessible to the Spanish are starting to fall under its command. So, for example, Moro and Igorot territory are slowly overtaken in the 1850s onwards. After centuries of resistance, this period actually is a time of conquest again for these areas na nag-escape ng Spanish control. Of course, not all of the areas in the Cordilleras or in Mindanao were successfully overtaken by the Spanish, but many of the important centers of commerce were parang overpowered by the Spanish during this period. So a reflection of this is they establish military provinces in the Gran Cordillera Central and in the Muslim South. In 1846, La Trinidad is founded in Benguet as the Spanish outpost here, because I'm in the area of Baguio and Benguet, diba? So, in the south naman, the Sultanate's navies are defeated and their territories are taken into Spanish jurisdiction. So, after centuries of pushing against the Spanish intrusion, during this time, naging provinces na ng Spain yung ibang Muslim territories in Mindanao and Sulu. How were they? Well, it's another question of how the Spanish were able to do this, pero very quickly, it was a mixture of increased technology and strategy, particularly with the introduction of the Spanish steamboat that was able to attack territories in the Muslim South na dati inaccessible sa kanila. Anyway, another major change is because of the British invasion that you'll remember from our global contexts in previous segments, no? The Guardia Civil is established in the Philippines. This is a paramilitary police force auxiliary to the military. So the Guardia Civil and military abuses remain a major source of unrest for Filipinos during these periods in time. So Ayun, here is a primary source. This is from the time na co-op na or na conquer na yung Sultanate of Sulu. This is really cool. Like I love this document. You see this dragonfly shape here? That's the signature of the Sultan of Sulu. So this is the receipt for the salary of that sultan. After their unequal alliance was imposed in the 1850s. So now, parang they had a level of autonomy in ruling themselves, pero they were under Spanish command, and one of the proof for that is sinusweldohan na ng Spanish government yung Sultan of Sulu. Here is an early picture of La Trinidad in the early 1900s. And, it's a very nice picture. But actually, before the Spanish arrived, or when the Spanish arrived, there were about 500 houses in the valley of La Trinidad. But after their incursions there, bumaba ng about 180 to 200. So, more than halved yung population there. Part of that was because many people started running away to other parts of the Cordilleras to be safely away from the Spanish. But there was also sickness, killings, and all kinds of very challenging experiences in order for La Trinidad to be established. So, ayun, another primary source, but this time from the American period. Okay, so I'm sorry, this is supposed to be political reforms. I'll change it when I upload the slides. So, what were the effects exactly of these many political reforms on Philippine society? So, may iba pa tayong hindi na nagay doon just to focus on the main ones, no? Pero in general, you find there is a politicization of the mestizo middle class. Now, what does it mean exactly when we say politicization? Politicization is a process by which a certain group of people becomes more involved in policy making, or they want to be involved in policy making or politics. So, members of the wealthy mestizo class in the Philippines identify themselves with the liberals because of economic and political advantages. So, ano nga ba yung pagmamayari ng mestizo class na to? They were business owners, hacienda owners, or at least people who had high management positions in these new forms of economy. And one of the things you need to happen is dapat protected ka from people who might claim your resources for their own. So that's one of the things they wanted, protection from unequal or racially biased policies by the Spanish. Now, that's just one example. They also wanted increased education in the Philippine Islands, less intervention by the Spanish friars in the way the Philippines was managed, and many other things. So, may mga demands sila. And these demands were brought by the fact that if these reforms happened in the Philippines, they were some of the people who had the most to gain from it. Now, there were more opportunities for the wealthy Indios, who were also known as principales from our much earlier discussions, and mestizos, to earn money because of the expanding economy. However, they did not have the same rights as pure-blooded Spanish, even if they had similar wealth and education. And so they wanted to be citizens of Spain and have representation in Spanish politics or the way laws would be crafted. So that was the effect on the middle class. Now, among the lower classes, particularly laborers, no, as we mentioned earlier, agricultural and especially urban laborers were now facing increased pressure to work under difficult working conditions and to pay additional taxes. Lower classes in urban areas have wider access to written materials and jobs that would require literacy because of the demands of urban life. So, you have more pressure on these classes. In fact, the pressure has been going on for centuries and centuries, diba? Because before this, these were the same groups of people that would have had to work for the galleon trade economy. So the pressure has been mounting, and you have additional taxes pa now. And then there's an outlet for that frustration, and that is to read subversive materials, to read about different ways that the Philippines could be governed based on what was happening in the wider world. So, nagbe-build talaga yung tension in different sectors of Philippine society. Okay, now finally, we're gonna talk about religious reforms. Now, religious reforms mostly came in the form of secularization. Now, what is secularization exactly? Now, first we have to talk about this conflict in the Philippines, the missionary order versus the diocese based secular clergy. What does this mean, right? Okay, so basically, you have a missionary order, and their job is to Christianize territories in a new colony. So, you know, like missionary work, you go to a place, you introduce the religion, and you kind of make sure that the people there aren't likely to return to their old practices. So once an area has been Christianized and resettled, in the case of the Philippines, you are baptized and you are relocated to the reducción, usually in an area or in the spatial order emanating from the plaza or from the pueblos, towns. You know, you get it. You've looked at that part of our spatial history before. So the job of these missionary orders is to get people Christianized and settled into these spaces. And afterwards, yung spaces na yun ay ito-turn over or yung parishes na yun, yung management ng towns na yun, ay ito-turn over sa regulars. The regulars are those people who manage the diocesan partitions of the Philippines. Now, think about it this way. Once you have Christianized new territory, there has to be a stable structure to allow you to collect church fees but also minister to the people there in the long term. So, hindi pwedeng isolated yung places na to. Dapat may structure, organizational, parang chart, kumbaga, to be able to manage all of those spaces. Now, here's an example from the present day Philippines. This is a modern map of Philippine ecclesiastic provinces before 2021. Now, of course, we're not going to go through all of these. The idea lang is each of these spaces has its own bishop. And then there's a structure that emanates from those places. So, may speciality din, kumbaga, yung pag-manage ng religious life of Filipinos. Now, the problem was, yun yung mga diocese natin. Our dioceses which are organized into ecclesiastic provinces. You don't really need to know all of those details. The idea lang is there's a conflict between your missionaries, your missionary orders, and your diocese-based secular clergy. Kasi dapat ito turn over yung territories na yun. Now, interestingly, most of there was a number released by, I think it was, hindi, wag na lang natin sabihin yung order kasi baka hindi sure yung author dun eh. A majority of those people who were regulars under the diocesan order were usually mestizos or even sometimes Indios. So sila yung, kumbaga, less racially superior, quote, quote, compared to your missionary orders or people from the missionary orders who were usually Spanish or even foreigners, other kinds of foreigners. So there's a tension there because they wouldn't turn over the parishes to your regulars. And it was very clear, especially from a royal decree na release, that they're supposed to secularize the parishes. They're supposed to turn over the parishes. So, naging part yun ng isang reform demand ng Filipino middle class na nasundin ng mga missionary orders yung ibinaba na royal decree saying that you're supposed to secularize the parishes. So, ang lumabas dun ay, it seemed that the failure to turn over those parishes was really more of a racial bias rather than an issue of whether or not the regulars were competently able to manage those parishes. So here are some characteristics of the secular missionary conflicts. Now, the secularization campaign was largely composed of Filipino clergy, yung mestizos and the Indios, and the missionaries were composed of typically pure-blooded Spanish. So, yung caricature nito ay si Padre Damaso from Noli Me Tangere. Remember, in his first lines, when he's introduced by Rizal, he's talking about how lazy the Filipinos are, how, they're unpredictable and volatile, and when you leave them, they just return to their heathen ways. So that they're not really Christian to begin with. So yung kind of mindset na yun was one of the ideas being pushed by your more conservative missionaries. And that was the reason they said that they didn't want to turn over these territories. Pero it was more true that they were able to establish large friar estates, and they were able to collect hefty amounts of money and resources from these spaces that they managed, whether it was a friar estate or a different kind of arrangement. So they also had something to gain from staying there. Now, the Spanish government in the Philippines, despite, the release of the order to secularize, was seen to take the side of missionaries based on race, not necessarily on competence or just allocations. So, a big example of this, and this leads us to the next slide, is the Cavite Mutiny of 1872. So, ang wild actually nang nangyari during this time. So this is a major context to the propaganda movement. So our religious reforms are actually deeply connected to our revolutionary history. So what happened exactly, if you don't remember or you don't know what the Cavite Mutiny is? A revolt by soldiers in an arsenal or a military camp in Cavite was mistaken by Spanish authorities as a wider call to revolution and independence. And this was used as a reason to execute and exile liberal-leaning padres, businessmen, and lawyers. Three padres aligned with the mestizo middle-class liberal movement or the secularization movement kasi sila ay mestizos. Three of these padres, Mariano Gomez, Jose Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora, were blamed for the revolt and executed despite lack of proof. And some of the people pointing to these liberal padres were your missionaries, your missionary orders na nakabase dun sa Cavite. So some statements were taken from your friars, your missionary order friars, and they were saying that these three had instigated the parang the revolt, when in fact there was very little proof of this. In fact, ang lumalabas ay yung nag-instigate ng revolt ay hindi sila Gomez, Burgos at Zamora, kundi ibang tao na may parang discontented sila against the general that was managing that military camp. So that's another history altogether. The point here is, instead of conducting a thorough investigation into the involvement of the Gomburza in the Cavite Mutiny, they were summarily executed. So, in-execute sila agad kahit na hindi pa nare-release yung investigation results. And this was seen by many of their compatriots or yung kasama nila sa liberal movement as racially biased against these new Filipinos who were part of the liberal movement. So, this use of Spanish power against Filipino seculars and other liberals is one of the reasons for the start of the propaganda movement. So besides these three who were executed, a lot of other lawyers, students, businessmen were exiled to Guam and even to mainland Spain because they were supposedly part of the revolution. Pati nga yung yung anong tawag dito? Yung pamangkin ni Mariano Gomez na nakitira lang sa kanya kasi may sakit ay dinakip at in-imprison just because he was living at his uncle's house. He was actually sick nga and he couldn't have joined the Cavite Mutiny, but despite that, all of these people, parang, okay, here's an interesting parallel. It's kind of how red tagging works in the present day. No. So, sa pag-red tag, you kind of collect a bunch of people who were probably not even aligned with the specter you're trying to defeat. And then you say they're all part of the same group in order to parang make them less authoritative or make them unwelcome in communities so that they have less ability to forward the reforms in this case, the reforms that they wanted to push for. Kahit na hindi naman sila talaga part ng, kunyari, dito, ng revolt na in-instigate ng soldiers na hindi kasi nabigyan ng tamang sweldo. So, it's a very complicated event and typically people would discuss this in a couple of sessions. But the idea is, yung mga nagka-campaign for secularization were the same people who were part of the mestizo middle class who were gaining money or gaining wealth from this new agricultural export economy. And the Spanish were not happy with that. One of the ways that this manifested was paranoia on the part of your absolutist government na these people, even if they're only asking for reforms, are going to wage revolution. So, ironically, the effect of this event was more people wanted to campaign for reforms and for the protection of people like the Gomburza. People who would become part of the propaganda movement would include those who were highly influenced by the events surrounding that execution. Pasiano Gomez was a follower. Pasiano Gomez. Pasiano Rizal, for example, the older brother of Jose Rizal, was a follower of the preachings of Mariano Gomez and Jose Burgos in particular. So, yung mga kwento ni Pasiano Rizal would affect the way the younger Jose Rizal would look at these events in their history or in his own timeline. So you also have other stories from ilustrados who were greatly affected by the execution of the Gomburza following the Cavite Mutiny of 1872. So ayun, that actually leads us to um, the effects on Philippine Revolution that we saw earlier. So, ito na yung parang breaking point. And 1872 actually marks the beginning of an entirely new era in Philippine history. And that is, from this point onward, Filipinos are starting to form a national identity. And that national identity will result in the claim that we should be able to rule ourselves. And that would burst into the movement that was the Philippine Revolution. So that's what we're going to discuss in the next module. Thank you so much for sitting through this lecture. Again, here are some sources you can refer to if ever you want to read more into this period of history. Let's just do a really, really quick rundown. In Module 5.2, we looked at several things. And those were global contexts. Nasaan na yun? Yeah, global developments or global contexts that affected the way the Spanish were managing the Philippines. And this led to certain Philippine reforms that each had their own effects on society. So by connecting those dots, we're able to find the context surrounding the emergence of Philippine national consciousness and eventually the Philippine Revolution. Once again, thank you so much, and I will, or you will see me in the next module. Bye.